The Persian Gulf stretched dark and endless beneath a moonless sky, its surface like black glass reflecting nothing but the cold indifference of deep water. 60 nautical miles off the Iranian coast, the USS Columbia moved through that darkness like a predator, silent and unseen, her hull cutting through the depths at 400 feet below the surface. Inside the submarine's cramped combat information center, Commander Catherine Brennan stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on three monitors displaying streams of code that moved faster than most human minds could process. She was 48 years old with short gray hair, already going silver at the temples, and calm gray-blue eyes that seemed to see through problems rather than at them. Her uniform was crisp despite 16 hours on duty, her posture relaxed but ready like a coiled spring that knew exactly when to release. The code on her screens was wrong, not obviously wrong, not catastrophically wrong, just off, like a symphony where one violin was tuned a quarter tone flat. Most people wouldn't notice. Most people wouldn't care. But Catherine Brennan had written half the Navy's cyber warfare protocols, and she could hear the discord as clearly as a conductor hearing a missed note. "Commander," the voice came from her left. Lieutenant Collins, young and eager, and still believing that rank meant you had all the answers. "The carrier group's systems are showing green across the board. Everything nominal." Brennan didn't look away from her screens. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the fluid precision of a concert pianist, pulling data layers that most of the crew didn't know existed. "Tell me something, Lieutenant," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of electronics and ventilation. "When was the last time an Iranian fishing trawler maintained a perfect grid search pattern for 6 hours straight?" Collins pulled up the surface track display. Sure enough, a civilian vessel had been methodically sweeping the area above them, its movements too precise, too deliberate to be searching for fish. I didn't notice that, ma'am." "You weren't supposed to," Brennan said. "They're very good, but they made one mistake." She pulled up a secondary monitor isolating a data packet that had pinged off the Columbia's hull-mounted sensors 3 minutes earlier. To anyone else, it would look like routine underwater acoustic noise. Ocean ambience, background static. To Brennan, it was a digital fingerprint. "They're using the trawler's sonar to map our position," she continued, her voice still that same calm monotone. "And they're uploading that data to a shore station that's been trying to penetrate the carrier group's fire control systems for the past 40 minutes. They're not targeting us, they're targeting the Reagan." The USS Ronald Reagan flagship of Carrier Strike Group 5 was operating 200 miles to the east with 5,000 sailors aboard and enough firepower to level a small country. It was also at that precise moment, completely unaware, that hostile actors were attempting to hijack its weapon systems. Captain James Stafford entered the CIC, his weathered face showing the kind of calm that only came from 30 years of service and more close calls than he cared to remember. He was a SEAL before he was a submarine commander, and he moved with that peculiar economy of motion that marked men who'd learned to be silent in places where noise meant death. "Talk to me, Cat," he said, using the nickname that only he was allowed to use. Brennan's fingers never stopped moving. Code scrolled across her screens like water flowing downhill, and she was reading it the way other people read newspapers. "They're attempting a man-in-the-middle attack on the Reagan's torpedo guidance system," she said. "If they succeed, every Mark 48 on that carrier could be turned into a weapon against our own ships. We're looking at potential fratricide on a catastrophic scale. 5,000 dead in the first salvo." Stafford's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Can you stop it?" "I can stop it," Brennan said, "but I'll need to violate about 15 different protocols to do it, and I'll need you to trust me when I can't explain what I'm doing or why." It was a test. They both knew it. Stafford could order her to follow procedure, to go through channels to request authorization from the strike group commander. By the time that authorization came through, assuming it came at all, the Iranian cyber warfare unit would have completed their attack. Or he could trust the woman who'd saved his ass more times than either of them could count. "You've got 60 seconds, Stafford said. "Make them count." Brennan's fingers became a blur. She wasn't typing code so much as conducting it, her mind 3 steps ahead of her hands. She pulled protocols that existed only in classified briefings. Weaponized software that wasn't supposed to exist outside of theoretical papers, and her own personal toolkit of solutions that she'd developed over 20 years of hunting threats in the digital dark. 30 seconds. The Iranian attack was sophisticated, multi-layered, adaptive. It learned from each defensive measure and evolved accordingly. It was quite possibly the most advanced cyber weapon Brennan had ever encountered. 20 seconds. She stopped trying to block it. Instead, she gave it exactly what it wanted: access to the fire control system. But the system she gave it access to was a phantom, a perfect digital replica that existed only in the attacker's perception. They thought they were inside the Reagan's weapon systems. In reality, they were inside a sandbox that Brennan had constructed in real time, a trap made of pure code and mathematical elegance. 10 seconds. She traced the attack back through its own connection, following the digital breadcrumbs like Hansel and Gretel in reverse, and she found the Iranian shore station, found its command protocols, found the human operators who thought they were winning. 5 seconds. Brennan rewrote their own code against them. She turned their weapon into a mirror, and when it fired into itself. The Iranian cyber warfare unit's entire network collapsed in a cascading failure that would take them months to understand and years to rebuild. 0. The monitors went green. Every system, every protocol, every threat indicator. The attack wasn't just stopped. It was erased as if it had never existed. Brennan leaned back in her chair, her first movement in 60 seconds, and exhaled slowly. "Threat neutralized," she said quietly. The Reagan never knew it was in danger. Stafford looked at the screens, then at Brennan, then back at the screens. "Kat, what you just did, that was a violation of direct orders, 3 international treaties, and probably the laws of physics," Brennan finished for him. She allowed herself the smallest smile. "But everyone goes home alive. I'll take that trade." Later, in Stafford's private quarters, with the doors sealed and the conversation officially not happening, the captain poured 2 glasses of whiskey that wasn't supposed to exist on a submarine and handed one to Brennan. "Admiral Thornton called while you were saving the world," he said. "He wants you in Washington. Deputy Director of Cyber Command, corner office. 3 stars, the whole package." Brennan took a sip of the whiskey, let it burn down her throat. "I've turned down that job 3 times now, Jim." "I know, and he's running out of patience. So am I, frankly. Kat, you're the best cyber warfare officer in the entire Navy. Hell, probably the entire Department of Defense. But you keep hiding down here in the dark with us submarine cowboys doing work that nobody sees and taking credit for nothing. Why?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the amber liquid in her glass. "Because admirals sit in offices and make policy," she finally said. "They brief congressmen and shake hands and play politics. And that's important work, I suppose. But it's not my work. My work is here in the fight, where I can actually make a difference. The moment I take that promotion, I become a bureaucrat. And the Navy has plenty of those already." Stafford shook his head. "You can't stay a commander forever, Kat. Eventually they're going to force that star on you." "Then they'll force it," Brennan said. "But I won't ask for it, and I won't chase it. The work matters. Everything else is just noise." "You know what your problem is?" Stafford said, but there was affection in his voice. "You're too damn good at being invisible. Someday someone's going to notice. And when they do, you won't be able to hide anymore." Brennan's smile drained her glass. "The quietest sailors save the most lives, Jim. You taught me that." "I did," Stafford admitted, "but I never thought you'd take it quite so literally." The memory dissolved like smoke, and Catherine Brennan found herself standing in the pre-dawn fog of a very different morning 7 years later, and 1,000 miles away from that submarine, and that conversation, and that version of herself who'd still believed she could stay in the shadows forever. Mare Island, Naval Shipyard, California, October 2025. The fog was thick enough to taste rolling in from the San Pablo Bay like a living thing, swallowing the buildings and walkways in gray obscurity. Brennan stood at the main gate now, 55 years old, and wearing the 2 stars of a rear admiral, though you wouldn't know it from looking at her. She'd specifically chosen a plain olive drab flight suit with no rank insignia, no name tape, no unit patches. Just a woman in military-adjacent clothing with a small backpack over one shoulder and a personal tablet in her hand. The security guard at the gate was 19, maybe 20, with the kind of face that suggested he'd enlisted straight out of high school and hadn't yet encountered anything in the Navy that couldn't be solved with enthusiasm and a checklist. He was also, Brennan noted with professional disapproval, half asleep. She walked past him without slowing down. "Morning, ma'am," he called out, his voice automatic, his eyes barely focusing. He didn't ask for ID, didn't check her clearance, didn't question why a civilian was entering a restricted military facility at 5:45 in the morning. Brennan made a mental note on her tablet. Entry checkpoint Alpha compromised. Guard failed to verify credentials, challenge unknown personnel, or maintain adequate alertness. Security culture degraded. She walked deeper into the facility, her steps silent on the wet concrete, the fog turning everything more than 20 feet away into ghostly suggestions. The Sentinel facility was here buried 3 levels underground beneath what had once been a submarine maintenance building. From the outside, it looked abandoned. From the inside, it was the most advanced cyber warfare training center in the world. Brennan knew this because she'd designed it. Every line of code, every protocol, every system. She'd spent 3 years of her life building Sentinel from the ground up, creating the digital nervous system that would train the next generation of cyber warriors. And then she'd walked away from it, turned down the command position, and disappeared back into the operational darkness where she'd always felt most comfortable. But you couldn't build something that important and not wonder how it was doing. Couldn't create a child, even a digital one, and not check in occasionally to see if it was growing up right. So here she was, unannounced, uninvited, invisible. She passed through 3 more security checkpoints, each one as lax as the first. At checkpoint Bravo, the guard was reading a magazine. At checkpoint Charlie, the guard waved her through without looking up from his phone. At checkpoint Delta, there was no guard at all, just an unmanned desk and a sign-in sheet that nobody had touched in 3 days. By the time Brennan reached the main entrance to the Sentinel facility, she had documented 14 separate security violations, any one of which could have allowed a hostile actor to penetrate the facility's defenses. The heavy steel door was unlocked. Not just unlocked, propped open with a rubber doorstop, presumably to make it easier for the night shift to move equipment. Brennan removed the doorstop, let the door close properly behind her, and descended into the heart of Sentinel. The command deck was enormous, a cathedral of technology carved into the bedrock beneath Mare Island, 3 stories tall, 50 yards across, filled with holographic displays and quantum processors, and enough computing power to run a small country. Blue light bathed everything cool and clinical, making the 50-plus personnel scattered throughout the space look like figures in a dream. At the center of it all, on a raised platform that gave him a commanding view of the entire operation, stood Captain Derek Vaughn. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, with the kind of voice that had been trained to carry across a flight deck in a storm. His uniform was immaculate, creased with military precision, his chest heavy with medals and ribbons, that spoke of a career spent commanding ships and men and never ever being questioned. "Peterson," Vaughn's voice cracked like a whip. "That delay is unacceptable. In combat, 2 seconds means everyone dies. Do you understand me?" A young ensign, Peterson, jumped as if he'd been struck. "Yes, sir. Sorry, sir." "Sorry doesn't cut it. Sorry gets good sailors killed. Run that sequence again, and this time pretend like you actually know what you're doing." The ensign's hands shook as he returned to his console. The other personnel on the deck kept their heads down, focusing on their screens with the kind of intensity that suggested they were less interested in their work and more interested in not becoming Vaughn's next target. Brennan watched from the shadows near the primary server node, a position that gave her access to one of Sentinel's core systems while keeping her out of direct line of sight. Her tablet was already connected to the facility's network through a hardwired link that she'd installed herself during the construction phase, a backdoor that existed in the physical architecture itself. It was meant for emergency maintenance. Today it was her window into everything that was happening. She pulled up the personnel files. Captain Derek Vaughn, promoted to command of Sentinel 8 months ago, previously commanded a guided missile destroyer. Excellent marks in ship handling and tactical warfare. Zero background in cyber operations or systems architecture. His assignment here was political, the result of a well-connected admiral wanting to give a protege a prestigious posting. In other words, they'd put a ship driver in charge of a digital fortress and expected it to work out fine. Brennan returned her attention to the command deck, watching Vaughn interact with his crew. Watching the way they flinched when he raised his voice. Watching the way they stayed silent when they should have been asking questions. Watching a culture of fear slowly poisoning what should have been a culture of excellence. Near one of the secondary consoles, she spotted Petty Officer First Class Emma Sinclair, 28 years old, reading a technical manual during a lull in operations. Brennan recognized her from the personnel files, top marks in every training course degree in computer science, from Georgia Tech recommendations from every instructor she'd ever worked with. Exactly the kind of person Sentinel needed. Vaughn noticed her too. He strode across the deck, his boots striking the metal floor with sharp, angry precision. Sinclair! The petty officer looked up, startled. Sir, what exactly do you think you're doing? Sinclair held up the manual. Sir, I was reviewing the authentication protocols. I noticed some inconsistencies in them. Did I ask you to review protocols? No, sir, but I thought, you're not paid to think, petty officer. You're paid to monitor Station 7. So why don't you close that little book, put your hands on your keyboard, and do the job you were actually assigned? Sinclair's face flushed red. Yes, sir. She returned to her station, the technical manual clutched in white-knuckled hands. Her initiative punished, her curiosity crushed. Around the deck, the other personnel carefully avoided making eye contact, each one silently grateful that they weren't the target this time. Brennan made another note on her tablet. Command culture toxic. Crew trained to fear leadership rather than trust it. Initiative actively discouraged. Sinclair showed analytical thinking was punished for it. Systemic failure. She'd seen enough. The inspection could have ended right there with a damning report that would have gotten Vaughn relieved and probably ended his career. But Brennan had learned a long time ago that reports didn't change culture. Only experience did. Only the kind of lesson that burned itself into memory and stayed there forever. So she stayed in the shadows and waited for the right moment. It came 20 minutes later. Lieutenant Garrett Mitchell, 26 years old and fresh from the Naval Postgraduate School's Cyber Operations program, noticed her first. He was monitoring the quantum encryption nodes, and his screen showed an anomaly, a user accessing the network through an unregistered hardline connection. Someone was in the facility who shouldn't be using the access protocols that didn't appear in any official documentation. Mitchell pulled up the security camera feeds, scanning for the intruder. Found her standing near the primary server node, perfectly still, her attention completely absorbed by the tablet in her hands. He should have reported it immediately, should have alerted Vaughn, called security-initiated lockdown protocols. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the woman's complete lack of urgency, the way she stood there, as if she had every right to be exactly where she was. Maybe it was the fact that her intrusion wasn't triggering any of the automated alarms, as if the system itself recognized her presence as legitimate. Or maybe it was just instinct, the feeling that sometimes the most important thing a sailor can do is watch and learn before acting. Mitchell kept monitoring her, but he didn't sound the alarm. Vaughn, meanwhile, was conducting a wargame simulation called Black Talon, a scenario designed to test the crew's response to a coordinated cyber attack on Pacific Fleet assets. He was in his element now, calling out orders, moving units across the holographic display, his voice filled with the kind of confidence that came from knowing that he was the smartest person in the room. All stations prepare for scenario escalation, he announced. Enemy forces are attempting to penetrate our defensive perimeter. I want countermeasures deployed in sequence, Alpha 3-9er. Show me what you've got. People. The crew responded, their fingers flying across keyboards, their eyes locked on screens. And on the main holographic display, the battle played out in real-time, blue icons representing friendly forces and red icons representing the enemy. All of it a carefully choreographed dance of electronic warfare. What none of them realized, what Vaughn certainly didn't realize, was that the Black Talon scenario was using deprecated authentication protocols that Brennan had specifically flagged as vulnerable during the facility's construction phase. She'd left them in place, deliberately, a test within a test, a trap waiting for someone careless enough to trigger it. Vaughn was about to be that someone. Brennan watched the scenario unfold on her tablet, seeing the data flows that the crew couldn't see, the underlying architecture that supported the simulation. She saw the moment when the Black Talon scenario's authentication tokens created a handshake with Protocol Omega Sentinel's emergency failsafe system. She saw the recursive loop begin to form, and she did absolutely nothing to stop it. Vaughn was still conducting his simulations, still barking orders, still completely unaware that he was about to trigger a catastrophic system failure. He noticed Brennan at the same moment the first error message appeared on the main display. Excuse me? His voice cut across the command deck like a knife. You there near the server node? Brennan didn't look up from her tablet. Her fingers continued their methodical movement across the screen, tracing data flows and authentication sequences with the kind of focus that made the rest of the world cease to exist. Ma'am, Vaughn's voice went up in volume and authority, in the kind of anger that comes from being ignored. This is a restricted military facility. How did you get in here? Still Brennan said nothing. On her screen, the recursive loop was building momentum seconds away from triggering Protocol Omega's lockdown sequence. She could stop it with 4 keystrokes. 4 simple commands, and the crisis would be averted before it began. She entered 0 keystrokes. Vaughn started moving his boots heavy on the metal floor, closing the distance between them with the kind of aggressive stride meant to intimidate. He was 6'2" and 210 pounds of muscle and authority. Brennan was 5'7" and 145 pounds of calm observation. Ma'am, I asked you a question. He was 10 feet away now, his face flushed red, his hands clenched into fists. This is classified space. I need to see your authorization right now. Brennan's eyes never left her tablet. The recursive loop hit critical threshold, and Protocol Omega activated. The change was subtle at first, a single line of crimson code appearing on the main holographic display, a small error message that 99% of the crew wouldn't even notice. But it was there and it was spreading, and within seconds, it would become impossible to ignore. Vaughn reached Brennan looming over her with all the physical authority his size and rank could muster. For the last time, identify yourself, or his hand shot out, grabbed her upper arm, fingers digging into muscle hard enough to leave bruises. He spun her around with the kind of force that was meant to shock, to intimidate, to remind her exactly who was in control here. And then he slammed her back against the cold steel bulkhead of the server rack. The impact wasn't gentle, wasn't careful. It was the kind of physical dominance that some men used when they'd run out of words and needed to reassert control through violence. The metallic thud echoed across the command deck, cutting through the ambient hum of electronics and ventilation. The room went silent. Every conversation stopped. Every keystroke paused. 50 sets of eyes turned toward the confrontation, and what they saw made them deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. Their commanding officer, a captain in the United States Navy, physically assaulting what appeared to be a civilian woman for the crime of being somewhere he didn't think she should be. Vaughn leaned in his face, inches from Brennan's, his voice a low, threatening hiss that somehow carried to every corner of the room. I gave you a lawful order. Identify yourself and your purpose here, or I will have you in the brig so fast your head will spin. Do you understand me? Brennan's eyes finally lifted from her tablet. They were calm, gray-blue like the ocean before a storm. They held no fear, no anger, no surprise. They looked at Vaughn with the kind of analytical detachment that a scientist might use to observe an interesting but ultimately insignificant specimen. Her body language was wrong too. Vaughn might not have noticed it, blinded as he was by his own authority, but anyone with training in close-quarters combat would have recognized it immediately. She wasn't bracing herself against the bulkhead in fear or submission. She was balanced, perfectly centered, her weight distributed in a way that would allow her to strike from 6 different angles. Her hands looked relaxed, but they were positioned exactly where they needed to be for maximum leverage and damage. She could have ended Vaughn in about 2 seconds. Could have broken his nose, crushed his windpipe, torn in his eyes, dropped him to the deck in a heap of agony and regret. She chose not to. Instead, she spoke for the first time, her voice quiet and measured, and carrying the kind of authority that didn't need volume. Your security failed at 4 checkpoints, Captain. Your crew is afraid to think. Your simulation is using deprecated authentication protocols. And you just committed assault on a superior officer. Vaughn's face went from red to purple. Superior officer, lady, you're not even wearing Sir, Gale, Mitchell's voice cut through from across the deck, sharp with urgency. We've got a problem. On the main holographic display, the single line of crimson code had become 10, then 100, then 1,000. Error messages cascaded across every screen, spreading through the system like blood through water. The ambient hum of the electronics changed pitch, became strained, became wrong, and then the alarms began to scream. Red emergency lighting flooded the command deck, bathing everything in the color of danger and panic. The holographic tactical display, which moments before had shown the carefully controlled chaos of the Black Talon wargame, dissolved into static, its three-dimensional complexity collapsing into two-dimensional noise. A synthesized voice, calm and emotionless and utterly terrifying in its mechanical certainty, echoed through the space. Protocol Omega engaged, system integrity compromised, lockdown initiated. Vaughn released Brennan, spinning toward the main display, his face transitioning from anger to confusion to the first stirrings of real fear. What the hell is that? Someone tell me what's happening. Mitchell was frantically pulling data logs, his fingers flying across his keyboard with the kind of speed that came from genuine skill. Sir, it's Protocol Omega, the fail-safe system. It's locking us out. Then override it. I can't. Primary control is locked. I don't have the clearance to. Another alarm joined the first, this one higher pitched, more urgent. The temperature in the room began to drop as the quantum processor cooling systems misread the lockdown as a meltdown scenario. Core meltdown prevention active, the synthesized voice announced. Helium vent in 10 minutes. Evacuate immediately. 10 minutes. 10 minutes until the facility's liquid helium cooling system would vent directly into the command deck, flash freezing everything and everyone in a tomb of supercooled air. 10 minutes until 53 people would die from a safety system meant to protect them. The crew's professionalism fractured. A junior officer ran to the main door, pulled the emergency release. Nothing happened. The electromagnetic locks had engaged 3 tons of reinforced steel, sealed tight enough to survive a direct nuclear strike. "We're locked in," the officer shouted, his voice cracking with the edge of panic. "The doors won't open." Wow, Vaughn was moving now, striding to the command chair, his authority reasserting itself through sheer force of will. Somebody override this. Now that's an order. But orders meant nothing to a system that didn't recognize his authority. All across the command deck, personnel were typing commands that went nowhere, pulling protocols that had been locked out, attempting overrides that bounced back as access denied. The holographic display continued its dissolution. The simulation they'd been running completely lost in the cascade of system failures. Console lights that should have been green were turning red one after another like dominoes falling in slow motion. Vaughn grabbed the communications panel, his hand shaking slightly as he keyed the microphone. "Sentinel Control, this is Vaughn. We have an emergency situation. We need immediate override authority." Static, the communications system was isolated, cut off by Protocol Omega's lockdown. Sentinel Control, respond. More static. They were alone. Mitchell pulled up the system logs, his eyes scanning thousands of lines of code, looking for the source of the failure. And there, buried in the authentication handshake, he found it. A specific data packet deliberately crafted that had triggered Protocol Omega's recursive loop. "Sir," he said, his voice quieter now, stunned by what he was seeing. "This isn't a malfunction. Someone deliberately injected this trigger code. This is a test." Vaughn's head snapped toward Mitchell. "A test? Who the hell would—" He turned back toward Brennan. She hadn't moved from her position against the bulkhead. While chaos erupted around her, while alarms screamed and personnel panicked, and the countdown to catastrophe ticked away, Catherine. Brennan stood in perfect stillness. Her tablet was still in her hands, still showing calm blue schematics, while every other screen in the facility blazed crimson warnings. Her expression hadn't changed. Not fear, not satisfaction, not vindication. Just that same analytical observation, watching the crisis unfold with the detachment of a researcher monitoring an experiment. In the doorway leading from the Commodore's office, James Stafford appeared. He was 62 now, his hair gone completely gray, his face carrying the weight of 4 decades in the Navy. But he moved with the same economy of motion that Brennan remembered from the Columbia, and when he saw her standing calm in the midst of the storm, his weathered face went pale. "Derek," he said, his voice carrying, despite not being raised. "Stop." But it was already too late. The test was in motion, and it had 8 minutes left to run. The countdown displayed on every functional screen, 8 minutes 43 seconds. 8 minutes until the liquid helium coolant system would flood the command deck, turning the air itself into a killing frost. 8 minutes until 53 people would learn exactly how it felt to freeze from the inside out. Vaughn stared at Brennan, his face a canvas of confusion and dawning horror. Around him, his crew descended further into panic. Someone was crying, someone else was pounding uselessly on the sealed door. The training, the discipline, the careful military bearing, all of it evaporating under the pressure of imminent death. You, Vaughn said, his voice hoarse. You did this. Brennan's calm gray eyes met his. I triggered the test, yes. Protocol Omega has a recursive authentication loop that activates when specific war game scenarios use deprecated security tokens. I designed that vulnerability deliberately. You've been running this facility for 8 months, Captain. You should have found it by now. You're insane. You've killed us all. No, Brennan said quietly. I've revealed what was already here. A command culture based on fear. A crew trained to obey rather than think. Security so compromised that a hostile actor could walk through your front door without being challenged. These vulnerabilities were killing you slowly. I'm just making it visible faster. Stafford pushed through the panicked crew, his presence creating a small island of calm in the chaos. Cat, how long? Brennan checked her tablet without urgency. 7 minutes, 31 seconds. Long enough. For what? For him to understand what he doesn't know. Stafford's jaw tightened, but he nodded. He'd seen Brennan work before, knew that her methods were unorthodox but effective. Still, 7.5 minutes was cutting it close even for her. Vaughn had regained some composure, channeling his fear into action. Chief Webb, can we manually override the cooling system? Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb, 48 years old with 26 years of service, looked up from his console. His face was pale but steady. Negative, sir. The quantum core is sealed. We'd need a plasma torch in 20 minutes just to cut through the housing, then disconnect the helium feeds. They're controlled by the same system that's locked us out. We can't access them. Vaughn spun toward Mitchell. Lieutenant, you're supposed to be our cyber warfare specialist. Do something. Mitchell's hands were already moving, fingers flying across his keyboard with desperate speed. Sir, I'm trying to trace the authentication loop, but it's buried in layers of encryption I've never seen before. This code it's beyond anything in our training manuals. Because it was beyond their training manuals. Brennan had written Protocol Omega using techniques that wouldn't be declassified for another 5 years, mathematical principles that existed only in theoretical papers in the classified depths of NSA research divisions. It was quite deliberately impossible for anyone but her to crack. 6 minutes. A young ensign near the rear of the deck lost control, hyperventilating, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't work his console. Petty Officer Sinclair moved to him without being ordered, placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, spoke in low, calm tones that Brennan couldn't hear but could easily read. The ensign's breathing slowed. He wasn't okay, but he was functional. Brennan noted it. In the midst of crisis, when the command structure had collapsed, Sinclair had stepped up, natural leadership emerging when it was needed most. Vaughn was at the communications panel again, trying every frequency, every backup system. Mayday, Mayday, this is Sentinel Command. We have a catastrophic system failure and require immediate assistance. Does anyone copy? Static answered him. Protocol Omega had severed every connection to the outside world. Mayday, somebody respond. More static. They were in a tomb, sealed and forgotten. 5 minutes. The temperature continued to drop. Personnel were starting to see their breath, small clouds of condensation forming in the red emergency lighting. The quantum processors hummed with strain, their cooling systems preparing for the massive thermal shock of a helium vent. Mitchell stopped typing. His screen showed thousands of lines of code, none of them making sense, all of them leading to dead ends and circular references. Sir, I can't crack it. This encryption it's like nothing I've ever encountered. It's almost like it's alive, adapting to every approach I try. Then try harder. I am trying, but whoever wrote this knew exactly how we tried to break it and sealed off every possible approach. It's perfect. Mitchell's voice trailed off as understanding dawned. His eyes moved from his screen to Brennan, really seeing her for the first time. It's not just good code, it's masterwork. Whoever wrote this is operating on a completely different level than anything we've encountered. Brennan allowed herself the smallest smile. The kid was smart, smarter than Vaughn certainly, smart enough to recognize when he was outmatched and humble enough to admit it. 4 minutes. Stafford moved beside Brennan, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Kat, I know what you're doing. I understand the lesson. But these are good sailors. They don't deserve to die for Vaughn's failures. They won't die, Brennan said simply, but they need to believe they might. Fear is an excellent teacher, Jim. It strips away pretense and reveals truth. Watch. She gestured toward the crew. And what Stafford saw confirmed what Brennan had already diagnosed. The command structure had completely collapsed. No one was looking to Vaughn anymore. Instead, they were looking to each other, forming small clusters of mutual support. Mitchell coordinating with Webb and two other technicians pooling their expertise. Sinclair moving between stations, offering encouragement and practical help. Even the ensign who'd been hyperventilating was back at his console, his fear channeled into focused determination. Without Vaughn's intimidating presence, without his demands for obedience and his punishment of initiative, the crew was beginning to function like an actual team. 3 minutes, 30 seconds. Vaughn saw it too. Saw his authority evaporating, saw his crew organizing without him. And something broke inside him. The confidence, the certainty, the absolute conviction that he was the smartest person in the room, all of it crumbling like a sand castle before the tide. Please, he said, and the word came out broken. He was looking at Brennan now, his eyes desperate. Please, whoever you are, if you can stop this, stop it. These people, they're my responsibility. I'm asking you. Please. It was the first real thing Brennan had heard him say. No bluster, no authority, no demands. Just a man who'd finally run out of pretense and found himself completely out of his depth. But she didn't move, didn't reach for her tablet, didn't enter the 4 keystrokes that would end this. 3 minutes. Sir Webb's voice cut through the tension. The helium system is entering prevent sequence. Once it starts, it can't be stopped. We're at the point of no return. The synthesized voice confirmed it. Core coolant vent sequence initiated. Evacuation no longer possible. Personnel advised to assume crash positions. 2 minutes, 45 seconds. Mitchell stood up from his console, his young face showing the kind of calm acceptance that came from knowing death was inevitable. Admiral Stafford, he said, his voice surprisingly steady, if this is the end, I want you to know it's been an honor serving under your command. Others echoed the sentiment, not to Vaughn, to Stafford, to each other. Small acts of grace in the face of death. Vaughn had collapsed into the command chair, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. All the authority, all the confidence, all the certainty had been burned away, leaving nothing but the terrified core of a man who'd finally realized how little he actually knew. 2 minutes. Brennan walked away from the bulkhead. Her movements were calm, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. The crew watched her with a mixture of hope and confusion. This woman who triggered their death sentence was now moving toward a secondary engineering terminal, one of the smaller consoles relegated to maintenance tasks and diagnostic functions. Vaughn looked up, his face streaked with tears. What are you doing? Brennan didn't answer. She pulled the coiled cable from her flight suit pocket, a custom piece of hardware that nobody in the facility had ever seen before. One end plugged into a shielded maintenance port below the engineering console, a port so obscure that most of the crew didn't know it existed. The other end connected to her personal tablet. Her fingers began to move. 1 minute, 30 seconds. It wasn't typing, wasn't the frantic hammering of keys that Mitchell had been doing. It was something closer to music, a fluid choreography of gestures and taps and swipes. She wasn't fighting the system. She was conversing with it, speaking its native language, with the fluency of a mother tongue. On her tablet's screen code began to flow. Not the standard programming languages that the crew knew, not Python or C++ or Java. This was something else, something fundamental, the machine language that existed beneath all the user-friendly abstractions. It looked more like mathematics than code-elegant equations that described the very architecture of Sentinel's operating system. 1 minute. On the main holographic display, still showing nothing but red chaos and error messages, a change began. A single point of white light appeared in the center of the static, small at first, barely visible, but it grew, expanding outward in a perfect circle, pushing back the red corruption, like dawn banishing night. 45 seconds. The white circle expanded further, and within it, the original tactical display began to reconstruct itself. The blue icons of friendly forces, the carefully balanced simulation parameters, all of it emerging from the chaos with mathematical precision. 30 seconds. More systems came online. Console lights shifted from red back to green. The temperature stabilized the cooling system, recognizing that the crisis was resolving. The alarms didn't just shut off, they were systematically disengaged in sequence from the least critical to the most urgent, a cascading restoration that mirrored the cascading failure in reverse. 15 seconds. The holographic display completed its reconstruction. The Black Talon wargame scenario sat frozen exactly where it had been when Protocol Omega triggered, as if the intervening minutes of terror had never existed. 10 seconds. The emergency lighting shifted the harsh red, giving way to the calm operational blue that was Sentinel's normal state. The main doors disengaged their locks with a soft pneumatic hiss. Fresh air began to circulate as the ventilation systems came back online. 5 seconds, the final alarm silenced. The countdown timer disappeared. The synthesized voice made its last announcement. Protocol Omega disengaged, all systems nominal, normal operations resumed. 0. Complete silence fell across the command deck. Not the silence of fear or anticipation, but the stunned silence of people who'd just watched the impossible happen, who'd stood at the edge of death and been pulled back by a woman with a tablet in 90 seconds of the most extraordinary technical prowess any of them had ever witnessed. Brennan disconnected her cable with the same calm precision she'd shown throughout, coiled it carefully and tucked it back into her flight suit pocket, gave the now stable displays one last analytical glance, confirming her work. Only then did she turn to face the room. 53 sets of eyes stared at her. Some showed relief, some showed awe, some showed the dawning recognition that they'd completely misjudged the woman standing before them. Mitchell was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "That code you used, that wasn't in any manual I've ever seen." "It's Sentinel's original source code," Brennan said quietly, "the foundation that everything else is built on. I wrote it in 2016. The implications of that statement rippled through the crew like a shockwave. She'd written it, not contributed to it, not worked on a team that developed it. She personally had created the fundamental architecture of the system they used every day. Webb found his voice next. "Ma'am, who are you?" Before Brennan could answer, Stafford stepped forward. His weathered face was grave, his movements formal and precise. He came to full attention, his back ramrod straight, and rendered the sharpest salute of his 40-year career. The kind of salute reserved for the highest ranks, the most profound respect, the deepest acknowledgement of authority. "Admiral Catherine Brennan," Stafford said, his voice resonating with a weight that made everyone in the room straighten unconsciously. "Welcome to Sentinel. This facility is yours to command." The word hung in the air like a physical presence. "Admiral," the crew's collective gasp was soft but audible, a rushing exhalation of shock and understanding and sudden terrible comprehension. They turned as one toward the main holographic display where Stafford was already pulling up a classified personnel file. And there, hovering in three-dimensional blue light for everyone to see, was Catherine Brennan's service record. Rear Admiral Catherine Elizabeth Brennan, United States Navy. 2 stars gleaming beside her name. Director of Special Cyber Operations Command. Lead architect of Project Sentinel 2015 to 2018. The list of medals and commendations scrolled past Distinguished Service Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, Defense Superior Service Medal with 2 Oak Leaf Clusters, Legion of Merit Navy Commendation Medal with Valor Device. Education credentials that read like a fantasy's Bachelor of Science in Quantum Computing from MIT Doctorate in Systems Architecture. From Caltech graduate of programs so classified that their names were redacted even in her official file. Security clearance TS/SCI-TK, top secret, sensitive compartmented information talent, keyhole. The kind of clearance that meant she had access to intelligence so sensitive that most of the people in the room would never know it existed. And at the bottom of her record in bold text that made several crew members actually step backward, current assignment, Sentinel Operational Readiness Evaluation. Status unannounced inspection. Vaughn's face had gone beyond white. It was gray now, the color of ash, the color of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. He'd physically assaulted the flag officer. He'd grabbed her, manhandled her, slammed her against the bulkhead, and threatened her with the brig, in front of witnesses, on camera, with every second documented. His career wasn't just over, it was obliterated. He tried to speak, his mouth working soundlessly, his hands trembling. Finally, words emerged broken and desperate. Admiral, you weren't wearing any rank. I didn't know. Brennan's calm gray eyes met his, and there was no anger in them. No vindication, no satisfaction. Just that same analytical observation, as if she were examining a specimen and noting its responses. That was the point, Captain Vaughn, she said quietly. A real adversary won't announce themselves. They won't wear rank insignia or identify their purpose. They'll look like a lost analyst with a tablet. Your security failed at 4 different checkpoints because your guards were complacent. Your crew panicked under pressure because you trained them to fear you rather than trust you. Your systems were vulnerable because you never bothered to understand them. And you committed assault on a superior officer because you made assumptions based on gender and appearance. Each word was delivered without heat, without judgment, just simple factual observation, which somehow made them more devastating than any shouted accusation could have been. Stafford stepped forward, his voice formal. Captain Vaughn, you are hereby relieved of command, pending a full investigation into your conduct and the operational readiness of this facility. You will confine yourself to quarters. 2 Marines will escort you. As if summoned by the words, 2 Marine guards appeared at the entrance to the command deck. They moved with the silent efficiency of professionals flanking Vaughn but not touching him. Not yet, giving him the dignity of walking out under his own power. Vaughn stood slowly, his legs barely supporting him. He looked around the command deck one last time at the crew he'd commanded with fear and intimidation, at the systems he'd never truly understood, at the Admiral he'd assaulted in his arrogance. Admiral Brennan, he said, his voice cracking. I'm sorry, I never meant to. Your intent is irrelevant, Brennan said. Only your actions matter, and your actions demonstrated a fundamental failure of judgment, character, and competence. The Marines guided Vaughn toward the exit. He went without resistance, without protest, a broken man who'd finally understood exactly how far he'd fallen. The moment the door sealed behind him, the command deck erupted in a chaos of whispered conversations, shocked exclamations, nervous glances. 52 people trying to process what they'd just witnessed, trying to reconcile the quiet woman in the plain flight suit with the legend whose service record now glowed above them. Brennan let them talk for 30 seconds. Then she spoke, her voice not loud, but somehow cutting through every conversation. Return to your stations. The effect was immediate. The crew snapped to attention, moved to their consoles, their movements sharp and precise in a way they hadn't been under Vaughn's command. This wasn't fear driving them. It was respect, the deep bone-level recognition that they were in the presence of genuine authority. The test you just experienced was designed to evaluate your crisis response capabilities under catastrophic conditions, Brennan continued. You were not supposed to solve it. Protocol Omega's recursive loop is deliberately unsolvable without specific knowledge of the source code architecture. This was an assessment of your procedures, your culture, your ability to function when normal command structure breaks down. She paused, letting that sink in. You failed, she said simply. Your initial response was panic. Your communication broke down. Your security protocols had already failed before the crisis even began. But, and here her voice softened slightly, the first hint of warmth creeping into that analytical tone. But when the command structure collapsed, when you could no longer rely on orders from above, you began to function as a team. Lieutenant Mitchell coordinated technical response without being told. Chief Webb provided systems expertise. Petty Officer Sinclair maintained morale and assisted personnel in distress. Even in failure, you demonstrated the potential for excellence. Mitchell, still standing at his console, spoke up. His voice was respectful but curious. Admiral, the code you used to resolve the crisis, I pulled the system logs. It's not in any manual or training program I've ever seen. Because it's Sentinel's original source code, Brennan said. The foundation layer that everything else is built on. What you've been trained on are abstractions, user interfaces, standardized protocols, approved procedures. I showed you the machine language beneath all of that, the raw architecture. She walked to Mitchell's console, gestured for him to pull up the logs. When the code appeared on his screen, she traced one elegant equation with her finger. This is a recursive authentication bypass using quantum entanglement principles, she said. It doesn't exist in your training manuals, because the mathematics behind it won't be declassified for another 3 years. But I needed it when I built Sentinel, so I developed it myself. Mitchell stared at the code with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious texts. It's beautiful. It's like poetry in mathematics. Efficiency is its own form of elegance, Brennan said. Every line serves multiple purposes. No wasted operations, no redundant processes. That's the difference between adequate code and masterwork. She turned to address the full crew again. I will be conducting a comprehensive review of Sentinel's operations over the next few weeks. This will include systems audits, personnel interviews, security assessments, and cultural evaluation. My goal is not punishment. My goal is to ensure that this facility is prepared for real-world threats, not just simulated ones. Stafford stepped forward. Admiral, the crew needs to understand the stakes. Why this matters. Brennan nodded. Commodore Stafford is correct. When Sentinel was designed in 2015, it was purely a training facility. But in 2023, after I'd moved to other assignments, this facility was upgraded and connected to active Pacific Fleet combat systems. You're not just running simulations anymore. The work you do here directly supports real warships, real missions, real sailors in harm's way. She pulled up a classified tactical map on the main display showing the disposition of the Pacific Fleet. Carrier strike groups, submarine patrols, surface action groups, all of it connected through data links that ran through Sentinel's infrastructure. If a hostile actor penetrates this facility, they don't just compromise training exercises, Brennan continued. They compromise the entire fleet. They could disable communications, corrupt targeting data, sabotage navigation systems. The catastrophic failure you just experienced in simulation could become a catastrophic failure in combat. And instead of 53 people at risk, you'd have 50,000. The crew absorbed this in silence. The weight of their responsibility, previously abstract, suddenly very real. Sinclair raised her hand hesitantly. Admiral, permission to speak. Always petty officer. I don't require permission for questions. I require them to be good questions. Ma'am, the authentication protocol issue I noticed 3 weeks ago, Captain Vaughn told me to stop wasting time on theoretical problems. Was that related to today's failure? Brennan pulled up Sinclair's original report, which had been filed and subsequently ignored. You identified a buffering lag in the encryption handshake sequence. You were correct that lag is caused by legacy authentication tokens, creating latency in the data stream. It's not a critical failure on its own, but it's part of the same vulnerability architecture that allowed Protocol Omega to be triggered. So if he'd listened to me, if Captain Vaughn had fostered a culture where junior personnel felt safe raising concerns, yes, this vulnerability might have been addressed months ago. That's the lesson here, petty officer. Technical competence matters, but it's worthless in a culture of fear. Brennan looked around the command deck, making eye contact with personnel across all ranks. I need to be clear about something. Captain Vaughn's failure was not unique to him. It's systemic in military culture. We promote people for tactical excellence, for leadership under fire, for ability to command ships and aircraft. But we often fail to promote for technical depth, for intellectual curiosity, for the kind of quiet competence that prevents crises rather than responding to them. She gestured to the displays around them. This facility represents the future of warfare, not ships trading gunfire, not aircraft dropping bombs, but invisible battles fought in milliseconds by people who understand systems architecture and code elegance and the mathematical principles underlying modern technology. Your enemy won't look like an enemy. They'll look like routine network traffic. They'll hide in the spaces between legitimate operations. And the only way to defeat them is to understand the battlefield at a level deeper than they do. Mitchell spoke again. Admiral, how do we get to that level? How do we learn to see what you see? Brennan was quiet for a moment, considering. You start by questioning everything. By refusing to accept that's how we've always done it as an answer. By being willing to admit ignorance so you can eliminate it. By valuing understanding over compliance. She turned to Stafford. Commodore, I'm formally requesting Lieutenant Mitchell as my temporary assistant for this evaluation. I need someone who can bridge the technical and operational aspects of the assessment. Granted, Stafford said immediately. Mitchell looked stunned. Ma'am, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm qualified. You identified the test signature in the system logs when no one else did, Brennan said. You asked good questions. You admitted when you were outmatched. Those are the qualifications that matter. The technical knowledge can be taught. Intellectual humility cannot. She checked her tablet, noted the time. It's been a long morning, secure from general quarters. Return to normal watch rotation. Tomorrow at Iro 800, I want all senior staff in the conference room for initial briefing. Dismissed. The crew dispersed slowly, still processing everything that had happened. As they moved to their stations or headed for the exits, Brennan noticed them touching the bulkhead where Vaughn had slammed her against the server rack. Tentative touches, almost reverent, as if the spot had become significant. Stafford noticed too. They're already building a mythology around you. Mythologies are dangerous, Brennan said. They turn people into symbols instead of teachers. Too late, Kat. You walked in here as a stranger, exposed every weakness, triggered a crisis that should have killed everyone, then saved them with a display of technical mastery that most of them couldn't begin to comprehend. That's not a teacher. That's a legend. Brennan allowed herself a small smile. Then I'll have to work extra hard to be human. Come on, Jim, you and I need to talk about what happens next. They walked towards Stafford's office, leaving the command deck to buzz with excited conversations with detailed recountings of every moment, with the beginning of a story that would be told and retold until it took on a life of its own. The day the ghost walked the bridge. The day the silent Admiral revealed herself. The day everything changed. Behind them, young Garrett Mitchell sat at his console, staring at the lines of code that Brennan had used to save them all, trying to understand the elegant mathematics that had seemed like magic. His fingers moved across his keyboard, tentatively tracing the logic following the pathways. Beside him, Emma Sinclair pulled up her original authentication report, the one that had been ignored, and began to expand it. If Admiral Brennan valued questions, then Sinclair had hundreds of them. And in his quarters under Marine Guard, Derek Vaughn sat on his bunk and stared at nothing, his mind replaying every moment of his catastrophic failure, understanding for the first time in his life exactly how much he didn't know. The education had begun. 3 days after Protocol Omega's activation, Catherine Brennan sat in what had been Derek Vaughn's office, surrounded by data that told the story of systemic failure. Personnel files spread across 3 monitors. Security audit logs scrolling past on a 4th. Training records, incident reports, maintenance schedules, communication transcripts. The digital autopsy of a facility that had been dying slowly for months. Garrett Mitchell stood beside her desk, a tablet in his hands. Dark circles under his eyes from 72 hours of minimal sleep. He'd thrown himself into the evaluation with the intensity of a man who'd glimpsed something extraordinary and desperately wanted to understand it. The pattern is consistent across all departments, Mitchell said, pulling up a chart that showed crew performance metrics over the past 8 months. When Captain Vaughn took command, efficiency dropped 17% in the first quarter. Error rates increased. Personnel transfer requests tripled. But nobody reported it up the chain because reporting problems was punished. Brennan finished. She'd seen this pattern before in other commands, other services. Fear-based leadership created a culture of silence, and silence allowed rot to spread unchecked. What about the security breaches I documented on entry? I interviewed all 4 guards personally. They all said the same thing. Captain Vaughn emphasized speed over thoroughness. He wanted VIP visitors processed quickly to avoid delays. The guards interpreted that as permission to be lax with everyone. Brennan made a note. One careless order filtered through a culture of compliance becomes systemic failure. What did you find on the technical side? Mitchell's expression grew troubled. That's where it gets worse. I've been reviewing the system logs for the past 3 months. There have been 17 minor intrusion attempts. Routine probes, the kind we see constantly. But 6 of them use techniques that suggest sophisticated state actors. China, probably Russia. They were mapping our defenses. He pulled up the intrusion signatures, and Brennan studied them with the focused intensity of a chess master analyzing an opponent's opening moves. The patterns were subtle, carefully disguised as routine network traffic. Most security analysts would have missed them entirely. You found these yourself, she asked. Petty Officer Sinclair found the first 3. I found the others after she showed me what to look for. Brennan looked up, interested. Sinclair identified state-level intrusion attempts and reported them. She tried. Captain Vaughn told her she was being paranoid, logged her reports as low priority, and never forwarded them to Cyber Command. That was worse than incompetence. That was dereliction. Brennan pulled up the intrusion logs herself, tracing the attack vectors with practiced efficiency. What she found made her jaw tighten, the only outward sign of anger she'd shown since arriving. These weren't just probes, she said quietly. They were preparing for a coordinated attack, mapping our architecture, identifying vulnerabilities, establishing digital footholds. If they'd launched their primary assault, they could have penetrated Sentinel's core systems in under 5 minutes. Mitchell's face went pale. And with Sentinel compromised, they'd have access to the entire Pacific Fleet's operational data, ship positions, communication protocols, weapons systems integration. It would be Pearl Harbor in the digital age. Brennan stood paced to the window overlooking the command deck below. Personnel moved with visible purpose, now their posture different than it had been 3 days ago. More alert, more engaged. The culture was already shifting even without Vaughn's toxic presence. "We need to shore up the defenses," Mitchell said. "Redesign the security architecture, implement new authentication protocols." "No," Brennan said. Mitchell looked confused. "Ma'am, we need to teach the crew to think like defenders instead of operators. I can redesign the security protocols, but that's just putting a new lock on the same door. What happens when I leave and the next vulnerability emerges? Will they recognize it? Will they know how to adapt?" She turned back to face him. "I'm not here to fix Sentinel, Lieutenant. I'm here to teach the people who run it to fix themselves. That's the only sustainable solution." A knock at the door interrupted them. Stafford entered carrying 2 cups of coffee and the kind of expression that suggested he had news Brennan wouldn't like. "The preliminary court-martial paperwork for Vaughn came through," he said, handing Brennan one of the cups. "JAG wants your formal statement about the assault." Brennan sipped the coffee, considering. "What's your read on him, Jim?" Stafford settled into a chair, his weathered face thoughtful. "Derek Vaughn is an ass. Arrogant, dismissive, completely out of his depth, technically. But he's not malicious. He's a product of a system that promoted him for the wrong reasons and put him in a position he was never qualified for. That doesn't excuse assault on a flag officer." "No, it doesn't. But Kat, you've always believed in redemption over punishment. What happened 30 years ago, when I could have ended your career?" Brennan smiled slightly at the memory. "You gave me a second chance, sent me to advanced training instead of a court-martial, told me that potential without humility was just arrogance waiting to fail bigger. And look how that turned out," Stafford said. "You became the finest officer I've ever served with. So I'm asking, does Vaughn deserve the same chance you got?" Brennan was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. "The difference is I crashed a drone. Derek Vaughn nearly got 53 people killed through negligence and attacked a superior officer. The scale is different. Is it, or are you just older and less forgiving?" That hit home. Brennan looked at Stafford, saw the gentle challenge in his eyes. He wasn't wrong. She'd become harder over the years, less willing to tolerate failure, more demanding of excellence. It was effective, but it was also limiting. "What would you recommend?" she asked. "Give him Yuma. 2 years managing supply, logistics in the desert. No command authority, no glory, just the kind of unglamorous work that forces you to see the people who actually make the Navy function. If he learns from it, he might salvage something. If he doesn't, he'll fade into obscurity. Either way, it's more merciful than destroying him publicly." Brennan nodded slowly. "Arrange it. Non-judicial punishment for the assault. It goes in his record permanently. Reassignment to logistics. If he performs well, maybe he gets another chance. If not, he's done." "I'll draft the orders," Stafford said. He stood paused at the door. "You're doing the right thing, Kat." After he left, Mitchell spoke carefully. "Admiral, permission to ask a personal question." "Granted. Why are you being merciful to someone who attacked you and failed this command so badly?" Brennan returned to her desk, pulled up an old photo on her personal files. A young lieutenant, barely 25 years old, standing beside the wreckage of a prototype surveillance drone. Her face in the photo showed arrogance mixed with shock, the expression of someone who just learned they weren't as smart as they thought. "That's me 33 years ago," she said. "I was an E4 who'd just received my commission. Brilliant, arrogant, absolutely certain I knew better than everyone else. Captain Stafford told me not to fly that drone without backup systems installed. I ignored him, flew it anyway, crashed it into San Diego Bay. $3 million in taxpayer money gone. Mitchell studied the photo. What happened? Stafford had every reason to end my career right there. Insubordination, destruction of government property, reckless endangerment. But instead, he sat me down and said something I've never forgotten. Brennan, you have potential, but potential without humility is just arrogance waiting to fail bigger. I'm giving you one chance to learn from this. Don't waste it. She closed the file. I didn't waste it, and maybe Derek Vaughn won't either. But the lesson only works if the failure burns deep enough to remember. That's why Yuma, it'll be 2 years of daily reminders that he doesn't know everything. Mitchell absorbed this, then changed subjects. Admiral, what's the plan for the next 2 weeks? You mentioned a comprehensive evaluation. Brennan pulled up a schedule she'd drafted. Days 1 through 5, I observe normal operations without interfering. I want to see how the crew functions without Vaughn's presence. Days 6 through 10, they conduct individual mentoring sessions with key personnel. Days 11 through 14, we run stress tests, realistic threat scenarios that will push the crew to their limits. Day 15, final evaluation and recommendations. And after that, I return to Washington and you continue the work. This facility doesn't need me to babysit it. It needs competent people who understand the mission. A notification appeared on Brennan's tablet. She glanced at it and her expression shifted subtly, not quite concern, but increased attention. What is it? Mitchell asked. Automated alert from the intrusion detection system. Another probe's similar signature to the one Sinclair identified. Brennan was already moving, heading for the door. Come on, time for a practical lesson. They descended to the command deck where the evening watch was in progress. Fewer personnel than day shift, but the same level of alertness. Sinclair was at Station 7 monitoring network traffic, and she noticed the alert at the same moment Brennan arrived. Admiral, Sinclair said, standing at attention. We've got an anomalous data packet attempting to access the auxiliary authentication server. At ease, Petty Officer. Talk me through what you're seeing. Sinclair pulled up her analysis. The packet is disguised as routine system maintenance traffic, but the timing is wrong. Maintenance protocols run at both 300, not 2147. The source IP traces back to a commercial server farm in Seattle, but the routing suggests it bounced through at least 4 proxies. Good catch, Brennan said. What's your assessment? I think it's another mapping attempt. They're testing our response time, seeing how long it takes us to identify and block suspicious traffic. You're correct. Now, what would Captain Vaughn have told you to do? Sinclair's expression tightened. Log it as low priority and continue monitoring. And what are you going to do instead? Sinclair looked uncertain, glancing at the other personnel on watch. Chief Webb was monitoring her from across the deck, and several technicians had stopped their work to observe. Permission to actively trace the intrusion and implement countermeasures, Sinclair asked. Denied, Brennan said. Sinclair blinked, surprised. Ma'am, you don't need my permission, Petty Officer. This is your watch. These are your systems. You identified a threat. You have the authority to respond. So respond. The words hung in the air like a challenge and an invitation. Sinclair looked at the data on her screen, then at Brennan, then back at the screen. Something shifted in her posture, a straightening, a squaring of shoulders. Chief Webb, she called out, her voice steady, I need you to isolate the auxiliary authentication server. We're going to let this intrusion attempt continue while we trace its origin. Webb moved immediately. Isolation in progress. You've got a clean sandbox, Sinclair. Sinclair's fingers began to move with new confidence. She set up a honeypot environment, a false target that would appear legitimate to the attacker while actually feeding them useless data. Then she began the reverse trace following the intrusion back through its proxy chain. Brennan watched without interfering, but she pulled Mitchell aside and spoke quietly. This is what competent leadership looks like. I'm not doing the work. I'm creating the conditions where she feels safe doing the work herself. She's good, Mitchell observed. Why was she stuck at a basic monitoring station? Because Vaughn was intimidated by competence he didn't understand. Watch what happens when you remove that obstacle. Sinclair worked for 7 minutes, methodical and precise. She peeled back the proxy layers one at a time, documenting each hop, building a complete picture of the attack's infrastructure. Finally, she found the source, not Seattle, but a server in St. Petersburg, Russia. Got you, she muttered, then louder. Admiral, the intrusion originates from a known GRU cyber warfare facility. This is definitely state-sponsored. Excellent work, Brennan said. Now what do you do with that information? I should report it to Cyber Command through classified channels and implement blocking protocols to prevent future attempts from the same source. That's adequate, but adequate isn't excellent. Think bigger. Sinclair stared at her screen, and Brennan could see the wheels turning. If they're testing our response time, that means they're planning something larger. We could use this probe to feed them false information about our capabilities. Make them think we're slower to respond than we actually are. Better, Brennan said. Chief Webb, how long would it take to set up a false response profile? Webb considered. With Sinclair's help, maybe 90 minutes. We'd need to coordinate with Cyber Command to make sure we're not stepping on any ongoing operations. Do it, Brennan said. Sinclair, this is your operation. You design the false profile. Webb provides technical support. Mitchell coordinates with Cyber Command. I'll observe. She stepped back, letting the crew take ownership. And what unfolded over the next 2 hours was a masterclass in collaborative problem solving. Sinclair designed a response profile that would make Sentinel appear vulnerable in specific, carefully chosen ways. Webb implemented the technical architecture to support that deception. Mitchell navigated the bureaucratic requirements to get approval from higher authorities. Brennan watched it all, offering guidance only when specifically asked, letting them struggle through the difficult parts. This was how teams were built, not through top-down orders, but through shared challenges and mutual trust. By midnight, the false profile was active. The Russian intrusion attempt received exactly the response it was looking for: slow, inadequate, easily evaded. The attackers would report back that Sentinel's defenses were weak, that a more serious attack would likely succeed. They'd be wrong. But they wouldn't know that until it was too late. After the watch change, Brennan found Sinclair in the crew break room, staring at a cup of coffee with the exhausted satisfaction of someone who'd just accomplished something significant. Permission to join you, petty officer. Sinclair stood quickly. Of course, Admiral. At ease. This is off the record. Brennan poured herself coffee, sat across from the younger woman. That was excellent work tonight. You identified the threat, developed an appropriate response, and led the team effectively. Why haven't you applied for officer commissioning? Sinclair looked down at her coffee. I tried once. Captain Vaughn said my application would be denied because I lacked leadership experience. He was wrong. You have leadership instincts that most officers never develop. The question is whether you have the confidence to use them. I don't know if I do, ma'am. When you told me I didn't need your permission tonight, I almost froze. I kept thinking, what if I'm wrong? What if I make a mistake? You will make mistakes, Brennan said simply. Every officer does. Every human does. The difference between competent and incompetent leaders isn't whether they make mistakes, it's how they respond to them. She pulled out her tablet, showed Sinclair the photo of the crashed drone. I told Lieutenant Mitchell this story earlier, but you should hear it too. 33 years ago, I destroyed $3 million in equipment because I was too arrogant to listen to my commanding officer. I thought I knew better. I was wrong. Sinclair studied the photo. What did your CO do? He gave me a choice: accept a court-martial and probably get kicked out, or accept punishment and the chance to learn from my failure. I chose the second option, and for 2 years after that, every time I felt too confident, every time I thought I had all the answers, I remembered that drone at the bottom of San Diego Bay. So the mistakes never go away. No, but they become teachers instead of failures. Brennan leaned forward. Emma, you're going to apply for commissioning again. I'm going to write your recommendation personally. And when you become an officer, you're going to make mistakes. When that happens, I want you to remember this conversation and choose to learn rather than hide. Sinclair's eyes were bright with emotion. Why are you doing this for me? Because 30 years ago, someone did it for me, and the only way to honor that gift is to pass it forward. Brennan stood. Get some rest. Tomorrow, I want you to brief the senior staff on tonight's operation. Your operation, your briefing. She left Sinclair sitting there processing the weight of opportunity and responsibility. The next morning, Brennan called Derek Vaughn to her office. He entered slowly, his uniform still crisp, but his bearing completely different. The arrogance was gone, burned away by 3 days of contemplating his catastrophic failure. What remained was something raw and uncertain. "Sit down, Captain," Brennan said. Vaughn sat, his hands clasped in his lap, unable to meet her eyes. "The preliminary court-martial paperwork has been withdrawn," Brennan said. "Instead, you're receiving non-judicial punishment for assault on a superior officer. It will be permanently noted in your service record. You will never make Admiral. You will probably never command a ship again. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." His voice was barely audible. "Additionally, you're being reassigned to Naval Supply Systems Command, Yuma, Arizona. 2 years. You'll manage logistics and inventory for a Marine Corps training facility. No command authority, no tactical operations, just the unglamorous work of making sure the right supplies reach the right people at the right time." Vaughn looked up, confusion breaking through his misery. You're not court-martialing me." "No, I'm giving you the same chance I was given 30 years ago when I failed spectacularly. But understand this, Derek, this isn't mercy. This is education. And it will only work if you're willing to learn." She pulled out a book, placed it on the desk between them. "Leadership and Self-Deception" by the Arbinger Institute. "Read this, then read it again. It's about seeing people as people, not objects. About understanding how our own biases blind us to reality." Vaughn picked up the book with trembling hands. "Admiral, I don't know what to say. After what I did to you, don't thank me. Earn it. Go to Yuma. Do the work. Listen to the people around you, especially the enlisted personnel who actually know how logistics functions. Learn to value competence over compliance. And in 2 years, if you've actually changed, maybe you'll get another chance. And if I haven't changed, then you'll spend the rest of your career in obscurity, and that will be exactly what you deserve." Brennan's gray eyes were steady, not unkind, but absolutely clear. "The Navy gave you authority, Derek. You confused that with competence. Now you have to earn the competence that should have come first." Vaughn stood, the book clutched like a lifeline. "I will, ma'am. I swear I will." After he left, Stafford entered from the adjoining office where he'd been listening. "That was generous," he said. "That was pragmatic," Brennan corrected. "Derek Vaughn has another 20 years of service ahead of him. Better to turn him into a useful officer than throw away that potential completely. Besides, if he does learn, he'll be able to teach others. If he doesn't, he removes himself from positions of authority. Either way, the Navy wins." The next 2 weeks unfolded with methodical precision. Brennan conducted individual sessions with every member of the senior staff, identifying strengths and weaknesses, developing personalized development plans. She ran increasingly complex threat scenarios, pushing the crew to their limits and teaching them to function under pressure without panic. Chief Webb learned advanced systems architecture directly from the woman who designed those systems. Mitchell received intensive training in strategic cyber warfare planning. Sinclair discovered that her analytical mind was perfectly suited for threat pattern recognition. And slowly the culture of Sentinel transformed. Questions became encouraged rather than punished. Initiative was rewarded. Mistakes were treated as learning opportunities rather than failures requiring punishment. On day 14, Brennan ran the final evaluation, a realistic multi-vector cyber attack that simulated coordinated assault from 3 hostile nation-states simultaneously. It was the kind of scenario that would have destroyed Sentinel under Vaughn's command. Mitchell, now functioning as acting commander, coordinated the response with calm precision. Webb managed the technical defenses. Sinclair identified and countered the attack vectors. The crew worked together with the kind of seamless coordination that came from mutual trust and shared competence. They didn't just survive the attack. They dominated it, tracing the simulated threats to their sources and implementing countermeasures that would prevent similar attacks in the future. When the exercise ended, the command deck erupted in spontaneous applause, not for Brennan, but for each other. Brennan watched from the observation deck with Stafford beside her. "You rebuilt this place in 2 weeks," he said quietly. "No," Brennan corrected. "I showed them what was already there. They did the rebuilding themselves." On her final day, Brennan gathered the entire crew in the main briefing hall. 200 personnel, including off-shift rotations, filling every seat and lining the walls. She spoke for 30 minutes and they listened with complete attention. 3 weeks ago, I walked onto this base as a stranger. I found a facility with excellent technology and talented personnel, but a culture that prevented both from reaching their potential. Today, I'm leaving behind something different. Not perfect perfection is a myth, but functional, adaptive, ready. Many of you have asked me about leadership philosophy. It's simple: create conditions where others can be excellent. Captain Vaughn failed because he believed leadership was about control. It's not. It's about enablement. True competence is quiet, not because it's weak, but because it's confident. It doesn't need to announce itself. It simply is. The best warriors prevent wars. The best leaders create other leaders. The best teachers become irrelevant because their students surpass them. You are ready, not because you can follow orders, but because you can think. Not because you're fearless, but because you can function despite fear. Not because you know everything, but because you know how to learn. The enemy will not announce themselves. They won't look like enemies. Your advantage isn't in seeing the uniform. It's in seeing the capability. In understanding systems deeply enough to recognize when something is wrong. In trusting each other enough to admit when you need help. I'm returning to Washington. Lieutenant Mitchell will be promoted to Lieutenant Commander and assigned as Deputy Technical Director. Petty Officer Sinclair has been accepted for officer commissioning and will attend OCS next quarter. Chief Webb is being recognized for technical excellence and recommended for Master Chief. But my greatest accomplishment isn't any individual success. It's this: when I leave today, Sentinel will continue to function, will continue to improve, will continue to adapt. Because the culture you've built together doesn't depend on any single person. The applause was thunderous, but Brennan slipped out before it ended, uncomfortable with adulation. She found Stafford waiting by her car in the pre-dawn darkness. "Leaving without ceremony," he said, "just like you arrived. Ceremonies are for people who need validation. I just needed to do the work." They embraced old friends who'd served together longer than many marriages lasted. "When you retire, the Navy loses something irreplaceable," Stafford said. "The Navy doesn't need me. It needs people like Mitchell and Sinclair. I'm just the bridge between generations." She drove away as the sun rose over Mare Island, just another car leaving the base, another person going about their day. Nobody recognized the legend departing. Behind her in the Sentinel command deck, someone had installed a small plaque on the bulkhead where Vaughn had slammed her against the server rack. They called it the Admiral's Corner, and every person who passed it for years to come would touch it and remember the day a ghost walked among them and taught them to see themselves clearly. 6 months later, in the blazing heat of Yuma, Arizona, Derek Vaughn stood in a warehouse managing inventory for 3,000 Marines. The work was unglamorous, repetitive, and absolutely critical. He'd learned more about the Navy's actual operations in 6 months than he'd learned in 20 years of command. When a young lieutenant arrived arrogant and dismissive of the enlisted personnel, Vaughn pulled him aside and told him a story. The story spread as stories do, of a captain who thought he knew everything and an admiral who taught him he knew nothing, of competence defeating arrogance, of quiet authority trumping loud commands. The legend grew. And in a classroom at MI, Professor Catherine Brennan taught advanced cybersecurity architecture to 40 students who had no idea they were learning from one of the greatest cyber warfare strategists in American history. She preferred it that way. The quietest heroes save the most lives. The best teachers create students who surpass them. The finest legacy is silence. And the ghost walked on. 2 weeks after Brennan's departure, the Russian attack came. Coordinated, massive, exactly as the probes had predicted. They hit Sentinel with everything: zero-day exploits, AI-driven adaptive malware, distributed denial-of-service attacks from 17 countries simultaneously. And they walked straight into Sinclair's trap. The honeypot Sinclair had designed fed them false data for 47 minutes, while Mitchell's team traced every node, every connection, every operator. By the time the Russians realized they'd been deceived, the NSA had complete maps of their entire cyber warfare infrastructure. The counterattack was devastating. Not destructive, Brennan had taught them better than that. Surgical, precise, elegant. When it was over, Mitchell sent a single encrypted message to Brennan's personal account. "The ghost walked with us today. Mission successful. 0 casualties. Enemy capabilities degraded by estimated 60%. Sinclair sends her regards. Brennan's reply came 3 minutes later. I never doubted. Now teach someone else.